Programs and Exhibits Committee of the Jewish Heritage Center, and we organize this program along with others. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Jewish Heritage Center, it's with its predecessor, the Jewish Historical Society. We're now 51 years old, and we have two missions. One is to explore and publicize the history of Jews in Manitoba and more generally in Western Canada, and secondly, to work on and provide Holocaust education, both of which we try quite hard to do. We have some of the programs that we run, just to mention it, in our big distinguished lecture of the year, the Saul and Florence Caney Distinguished Lecture Series on May 13th will feature the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Bret Stephens. Previously he worked for the Wall Street Journal, and he was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post before he came back to the United States and took up his work with the Wall Street Journal again, and then moved over to the New York Times as an op-ed columnist. He's noted for his distinctive and often controversial views on quite a number of subjects. He's an original thinker and very much worth listening to. His topic is the rise of populism, nationalism, and hate. Something that we might have stayed home to listen to on the television set. Sort of previous to that, to set the mood for it, on March 25th, the programs committee is running a program called Nationalism, Populism, and Anti-Semitism, then and now. That's Monday, March 25th in the evening. Presenters are Beljarniewski here, Executive Director of the Jewish Heritage Center and Chair of the Holocaust Education Committee, a branch of the Jewish Heritage Center, Editor of the Voices of Winnipeg Holocaust Survivors, she'll be talking about now. And then will be the film Paper Nazis by the Manitoba documentary filmmaker Andrew Wall, discussing anti-Semitism in Manitoba in the 1930s, from Victoria Beach to his relatives in the Mennonite Belt. And I mentioned in this connection that after this came about, we talked about it with Andrew Wall. His uncle, who unfortunately I've forgotten his first name, got in touch with me and said he's a permanent resident of Victoria Beach. Years later, no connection with the problems of earlier decades, but he said he and his friends felt very bad about it. They came, I showed them the Holocaust Education Center, I talked to them about the history of anti-Semitism in Manitoba, and they said, what can they do? And very generously made a donation to the Heritage Center, which wasn't a bad way to combat it, and to show their problems.
Mr. Wall was my teacher.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Wall was my teacher. And this was mentioned at his funeral 5 years ago. And I was doing my funeral in North Kelowna about his feelings as a Mennonite and as a resident of Victoria Beach.
Thank you. If you didn't hear, at Mr. Wall's funeral a few years ago, his feelings were expressed. There was discussion on this. He was a very sincere and a very lovely man. Our speaker, who's here, is both very easy and very difficult to introduce. He's easy because everybody knows him, and he's difficult because he's done so much. So I'll try to capture a little ground there. You know him, if nothing else, from today's Free Press with a column on Trump and the border non-problem, or the problem that's there, not the problem that Mr. Trump thinks is there. Allan Levine is the author of 13 books. He has non-Jewish books, such as the recent Toronto biography of a city, and William Lyon Mackenzie King, A Life Guided by the Hand of Destiny, which is an award-winning book. And he also has quite a few books on Jewish subjects, such as Coming of Age, A History of the Jewish People of Manitoba, commissioned by the Jewish Heritage Center, filled a very major gap in the historiography of our people in Manitoba, and it won several awards. Just to mention a couple of others: Fugitives of the Forest, the heroic story of Jewish resistance and survival during the Second World War II, and Scattered Among People, the Jewish Diaspora in 10 Portraits. If this isn't enough, Allan writes mystery stories, generally on Jewish topics. I'll just mention one because this is the anniversary year of the Winnipeg General Strike. A Bolshevik's Revenge is a mystery against the backdrop of the General Strike.
Okay, if I don't use a microphone, your mic can even come. So thank you for coming out today on a rather miserable week, and I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone at the Jewish Heritage Center, who, as Dan said, I've been associated with for many years. And trust me, writing a book commissioned by a Jewish community organization and dealing with a 12-member committee is an experience I shall take with me for the rest of my life. But it was fun. I'm glad the book was done. This is actually an interesting story. This is the book that I'm talking about tonight, and the reason I asked you to do it. It was published in November, and it's available at Untitled Chapters and anywhere else online across. But the interesting thing is, I didn't really plan to write it at all, and I really had thought there were many. Gerald Tulchinsky is probably the most well-known book of, a survey of Jewish history in Canada, and Irving Abel had also written some of it. Gerald's book was written. The first part was written in the 90s. So, but I was approached by people in Toronto, a large publishing company, decided, interestingly enough, a non-Jewish marketing person, which you wouldn't think, decided that the world needed another book on Jews in Canada. And I hesitated initially, but given the climate and the book business these days, when someone from Penguin Random House comes knocking on your door, you sort of just say yes, sir, and salute and move forward, because it's, I've been doing this a long time. My books, my first books were published in the 80s. The 90s were really, really great years. I noticed Jack Stoddard died, I don't know if you noticed his obituary. He was published a giant, although then he got squeezed by when Chapters came along and his company went. But in those days, in the 90s, Jack published, he was really interested in publishing Fugitives of the Forest. And in those days, there's so many publishing companies in Canada. Now, essentially, there are 3. Like Penguin Random House, although my book is published by McClellan & Stewart, it's actually owned by Penguin Random House. And there's HarperCollins and Simon Schuster Canada for like the big 3. Then there are other smaller publishers, but their resources are much limited. So it's really the world is tough. I mean, I don't think books will always be out there, but it's certainly I've seen over the last 25, 30 years I've been doing this a complete shift in how the book business is done. So here I was back then writing about Jews in Canada. Maybe it's part of my destiny, I don't know, to be connected to the story. And I did learn a lot, and I didn't actually spend some time in Montreal. It was the one city where I didn't know. I never lived in Montreal. I have lived in Toronto, so I was more comfortable with the story there. That's why I also wrote a book a couple of years ago about the city itself, in which Jews played a part. So I'm sort of coming back to a lot of these stories, and I've always been interested in that period from, let's say, 1880 to 1920, in which Winnipeg itself, as a vibrant community, was born, as well as the Jewish community, and most of your grandparents or great-grandparents came over from Russia or Eastern Europe, and that period's always interested me because it's also part of a larger story of the power of immigration, which in fact I keep writing about, as well as the way in which Canada was such a much different country, which I'll get to. So the name, let me just tell you, The Seeking, maybe most of you might know this or have heard of him, but Seeking the Fabled City is from an Abraham Klein or A.M. Klein phrase in a poem that he wrote in 1942 called Autobiographical. I suppose before Leonard Cohen there was A.M. Klein. Most of my friends have never heard of him. He was a Eastern European, came from Eastern European immigrant, and he was friends. He was a bit older than A.M. Klein. He was a contemporary of Irving Layton and David Lewis, who was one of his friends. Klein came from a more traditional family. David Lewis was more the Yiddish socialist, hence changed their name to Lewis. But the families clashed. Their fathers didn't get along. But Klein and Lewis remained friends. He was an interesting figure. Klein, he was also a lawyer and he was also a journalist, and he was the editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, which was the biggest English language Jewish newspaper for many years. So in his poem Autobiographical, he talks about these immigrants coming. It is a fabled city that I seek. It stands in spaces, vapors, and time's haze. Sense comes from my sadness and remembered joy, constrictive of the throat. The sense I hear is heard by a Jew boy. The Hebrew violins delighted in the soft Oriental note. So they did indeed find a fabled city they were searching for in Canada. Yet their acceptance, Jewish acceptance and integration into the larger society, was not always wanted or welcome, and the struggles they faced caused much inner turmoil and hardship. There are only two characteristics which most Jews have in common, a Jewish lawyer explains in Glethel and Graham's award-winning 1944 novel Earth and High Heaven, one of the first works of fiction published in Canada to address anti-Semitism. And she herself was a Jewish, and that's another interesting story. But one of them is determination to survive if possible, the other is a basic sense of insecurity. And that's how she approached it. The book itself is actually quite fascinating, and had it not been for the Gentleman's Agreement made into a movie and based on a similar story, that book would have been made into a movie. Mayer, what's his name? Mayer had bought the rights to the book, but then once Gentleman's Agreement was going to be made with Gregory Peck, and the first film about anti-Semitism, her project got canned, but it did win the Governor General's Award. It's a really hokey book in a way from our perspective, but it's kind of interesting. And her parents in the book, this non-Jewish girl is going to marry a Jewish lawyer, rather assimilated, but her father is so aghast because he realizes he can't take his son-in-law to any of his clubs. I always thought that was an interesting line. But she delves into it at a period of time when anti-Semitism was basically part of Canadian norm. The book structure, so is, if you look at it, I divided it into 4 sections. The first section looks at from the 1760s to the 1870s, really at a period of time where there weren't very many Jews in Canada. I mean, at the time of Confederation, there were only about 1,200, maybe less, and most of them in Montreal. There were, that period of time, so there were German and mostly British Jews coming out, not the most rigorously religious, because people who were religious weren't traveling in the 18th century across North America. Some of them were fur traders, most of them were merchants of some sort, but they more or less laid the foundation of the Montreal Jewish community, and a lot of them were involved in the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, which is like the oldest synagogue in Montreal, which I visited, and even though most of them weren't, none of them hardly were Sephardi, but they were mostly Ashkenazi, but they followed the New York similar Sephardic synagogue and got money from them, and so that was the custom of the day. And later they sort of split, and they did create another Ashkenazi, more traditional Ashkenazi synagogue in Montreal too. So you had sort of those two structures. So that's sort of an interesting period, only because they were such a minority. They weren't subject to, I would say, tremendous anti-Semitism. There was in the period of that period the great fight over Jewish emancipation that Ezekiel Hart was involved in. Again, not necessarily a story of anti-Semitism, but there were issues in which Jews were not treated equally. And that was probably the main story. But in most of their life, day-to-day life, they sort of just followed, they considered themselves Israelites and lived lives similar to their non-Christian neighbors. One of the more interesting people I actually didn't really write about a lot in the book that I discovered was a guy named George Benjamin, who was probably the first Jewish person elected to a legislative assembly in Upper Canada, which was before Confederation. But he did not want to be seen as Jewish at all. He changed his name to Benjamin from something a little more subtle. I always thought changing it to Benjamin, didn't exactly sound non-Jewish. But he came to the New World, but his name, they never let him. He was the owner of a newspaper in Belleville, the Intelligencer, and he was actually probably the first Jew that I knew to be a member of the Orange Order, which was an extreme Protestant organization, and then rose up to the top. But he didn't. His children weren't really Jewish, and he married. Him and his wife were eventually buried in a Christian cemetery. So but he's sort of his enemies certainly didn't let him forget. He was a conservative, and all the liberal newspapers hounded him, and they always reminded everybody that in fact he was Jewish, which is kind of interesting. So that period, and then there's a sort of a large chunk of the book from like 1880s till about the 1960s, where you have this transformation from what I see from Jewish Canadians becoming Canadian Jews, and it was this was a key theme. In 1919, for example, when discussion was underway about the establishment of a national Jewish organization, there was a heated debate naturally about what to call this new body. Suggestions included the Canadian Jewish Committee, the Jewish Canadian Congress, and the Congress of Canadian Jews. Ultimately, delegates to the inaugural convention decided to go with the Canadian Jewish Congress, like the Canadian Jewish Committee. It captured the essence of what the organization was to symbolize. Jews in Canada who put Canada ahead of being Jewish. The CJC epitomized their desire to fit in, to be citizens who would do everything in their power to enhance the country they called home, even though not necessarily everybody in the country felt or was all that welcoming. At the time, the Zionist movement was fighting for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and Jews were very careful because they didn't want to be perceived to be disloyal Canadians. The Zionist societies were established across Canada during the first decade of the 20th century, including, as you know, in Winnipeg. Jews fought in both world wars and encountered negative comments that they weren't doing enough. One of the more, and in coming of age, I highlight, one of the more interesting people I did find that I hadn't known about was a soldier in Vancouver called Joseph Seidelman, or Joe Seidelman, who was, because his family had donated all his letters that he wrote in World War I to his sister mainly, at the Jewish Museum and Archives of British Columbia, which have a nice website and a lot of archival material. And as it turns out, Joe, of course, he had a Winnipeg connection. His mother, Joe Seidelman's mother, her name was Esther Perlman from Winnipeg, and she moved to Vancouver, and she married Joseph's father, William, and they lived in Vancouver. He ran a store. He had a sister named Rachel. In 1916, Joseph was a student at the University of British Columbia, and nearly 6 decades later, his sister Rachel remembered him as a very able and bright young man. He felt compelled to do his patriotic duty, and at the beginning of May of 1916, he enlisted in the 196th Western Universities Battalion, which is made up of about 150 students from universities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC. Following a few months of training in Vancouver, Seidelman was in England by November. Early in 1917, he was sent to northern France and found himself in the mucky trenches of the Western Front, where the shelling was constant and death was a daily occurrence. In the first week of April 1917, Seidelman wrote to his sister about the lousy European weather. He also hoped that the war might soon end, though he was not optimistic. The chances of peace, he said, did not look as rosy as I thought. but the Huns will be defeated ultimately. In the dozens of letters Joseph sent to Rachel, he never once commented on any anti-Semitic incidents he experienced or witnessed, or indeed any issue related to him being a Jewish soldier, which I thought was interesting. Shortly after that, writing that last letter in April, Seidelman was one of thousands of Canadian soldiers who fought and won the battle for Vimy Ridge, which is remembered today as the country's defining moment of the war. The victory was costly. More than 3,500 Canadian soldiers perished during the 4-day battle. Seidelman, however, survived. He then ended up getting hurt later on, and he ended up, I think, in Passchendaele, where ultimately he died and was the first Vancouver Jewish kid to die in World War I, but his letters have survived. So he's just one soldier story that I tell. There was in Winnipeg, there was Sam Sheps, was another community. He's the son of community leader Ben Sheps, and so that was in World War II, and other Jewish soldiers. I mean, in World War II, I think Jewish soldiers felt more compelled to fight against the Germans as a sign that they were doing something. So they had a lot to live for, and there was a mixed bag of anti-Semitism. And as some soldiers encountered it, others did not. I mean, the general consensus that I have read was that they sort of ran into it. And a lot of Jewish soldiers ended up in the Air Force in World War II because the Navy was not particularly less welcoming to Jews, let's say. The Air Force somewhat more. And the last part of the book I call The Making of Tolerant Canada, which I've done a lot of work on from sort of the 1960s to the present. Is really about how the Canada we sort of know and think, and most people always think that Canada has always been this tolerant, multicultural haven, how it came to be, and it's also, I think, a very interesting story because it developed somewhat differently than most people believe. Jewish communities were organized from the bottom up. Apart from the earliest German and English newcomers, the large-scale Russian Eastern Europeans were defined by poverty. And so everything we have in terms of the institutions here, this place, schools, synagogues, a plethora of organizations, in some way or another really started with a small group of families, in those days mostly men, merchants, wealthier members of the community, who decided that they were going to build the synagogues and the institutions and support the kosher butcher shops and everything else, and really no one was helping them, and it's really, frankly, we take it all for granted. It's a rather remarkable story. I mean, if you think about the poverty of most of the Jews who came here after 1881, there's just a couple hundred before that, and they built up the community that we appreciate in Winnipeg. I know people in Winnipeg think they're very unique, and maybe to a certain extent they are. I mean, the same story is followed if you look at the histories of Toronto, Montreal, even St. John's, New Brunswick. I mean, it has to do with numbers, obviously, but you find a similar kind of story, finding a place to bury Jews, and then the synagogues, and ultimately the schools and the kosher butcher shops, and they always had, even in the first thing they did in the 18th century was find a person to kosher meat and do brisses or circumcisions, which I always thought was always the same guy. And it was hopefully he used the same knife. So I have two grandchildren. One my grandson's bris was in fact this morning, so maybe it's fitting that I'm talking about this. He's doing fine. I was not doing fine. Actually, it's all very civilized these days. They freeze the kid, and it's all good. There wasn't a peep from him. But anyways, I thought it was funny that I was talking about this today. I mean, I think the second. That's one story. I look at the beginnings of the community and the structure and the inner workings. There's a lot of arguing, as I've mentioned in other books, and throughout the community. And there's a lot of ideological divisions, and Jews are notorious for being along, Winnipeg had every possible ideology and along the political spectrum. There's a right, left, and in the middle, especially when you got the more Yiddish socialist type Jews coming, it added to another component of the community, and so there was a lot of infighting, and every side wanted theirs. So how else can you explain having about, in 1920, there's probably about 5-6 Jewish schools in the city that probably had about 15,000 people. I mean, that in itself is rather amazing. Even though many of them had financial issues, and that's always been a problem. And ultimately, over the years, those things shifted and mergers were done. But initially, these people stuck to exactly how they wanted their children educated, and they supported their own schools. The second theme that runs through the book, I guess, is anti-Semitism, because you can't necessarily avoid it. It's not obviously disappeared. Just this, 2 days ago, the graffiti at the cafe in Corda. But it has certainly, my view would be that it certainly changed. Being Jewish does not affect my life in a way that it, say, did my grandparents or even my parents who grew up in the 30s, and my dad was born in the late 20s, my mother in the 30s. But when anti-Semitism was entrenched and discrimination was legal, I mean, no one's going to say to someone, "I'm not hiring you because you're Jewish." So I don't know if my life I've ever been denied a job because I'm a Jewish. Perhaps. I mean, I ended up working most of my life at a place that didn't have a lot of Jewish educators, but they did. And it had a long history of being a sort of quote-unquote WASP institution. But that was legal discrimination. That was and clubs and resorts and Victoria Beach you mentioned. Those things went on, and no one really did anything about it. And I always thought the interesting thing was Canadians themselves, the majority, did not really believe they were anti-Semitic. They made these, especially in the 30s, you find them making these interesting distinctions. Editorials in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, they basically say, yes, what's going on in Europe is terrible, and the Nazis, or even Adrian Arcand in Quebec, those were bad people, or William Whitaker in Winnipeg, the violence, but not allowing a Jew to rent a cottage at a beach is not, that's just Canadian, and that's the way it was. Or the beaches in Toronto that had the same thing, and Joe Salzberg, the MP in the 1940s, attempted several times to rent a place, and he wasn't going to get anywhere. I mean, Jewish lawyers couldn't find, as you know, jobs. The University of Manitoba Medical School quota system that I've written about, McGill University was notorious. I mean, that was part of Canadian life. We were not multicultural. And then when Jews questioned this kind of thing, they got in trouble. I'll tell you, actually, one of my favorite stories that I came across, if I can just find it on my notes here, is called The Christmas Carol Controversy in Toronto of 1950. Hold on, I got it here. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. And I'll talk a little bit here. I'll talk a little bit about how this. But this is the Christmas Carol Controversy of Toronto, 1950. It was an instructive and reflective of the Canadian majority attitudes. In early December 1950, Rabbi Abraham Feinberg of the Holy Blossom Synagogue, which later became a big Reform synagogue, or already by then was, I guess, delivered a sermon in which he suggested that compelling Jewish students attending Ontario public schools to sing Christmas carols and participate in Yuletide festivities violated their minority rights. His remarks were directed against a noticeable expansion of religious instruction that had been implemented by the minority government of progressive conservative George Drew in early 1944. While the legislation did permit students to opt out with their parents' permission, it was a reaffirmation that Ontario was a Christian province and a Christian country. Curiously, the first criticism directed at Feinberg for these remarks came from 3 Orthodox rabbis who reminded him that Canada was a quote-unquote Christian country, whose school officials could include in the curriculum any Christian customs they saw fit. It is safe to assume that the three rabbis had zero patience and little respect for a practitioner of Reform Judaism. Next came a public rebuke from the Christian clergy as well as the press. The most cutting denunciation was courtesy of the Globe and Mail in an editorial of December 5th, 1915, titled, quote, "A deplorable proposal." The newspaper editors were astounded that someone, in particular a rabbi, would demand to eliminate Christmas from public schools, quote, ignoring the fact that that's not what Feinberg had actually said. From their perspective, the rabbi's suggestion was clearly sacrilege. The Jewish people in Canada, the Globe wrote, are on the whole an admirable element of the community. But they are a minority of 1 to 100. The majority has an absolute right to hold its own beliefs and express them in a manner acceptable to itself. Nobody should ask the majority to give up their right to be Christians in the full expression of that word, just to avoid hurting the minority's feelings. Feinberg, needless to say, had not anticipated such a backlash or public shaming of his sermon and felt compelled to apologize. Yet he could not win. A few Yiddish newspaper editors castigated him for being too humble. The lesson of this mini-controversy for the larger Jewish community was clear. Jews as a minority were welcome to live among the Christian majority, but they should never forget their place in the hierarchical structure. So that was, 1950, and I thought. Now, what's interesting is when this was going on, in fact, changes were being made and had been made in the early 1940s. I thought it's interesting because, in general, if you think about the way in which, let's say, marijuana became legal in Canada, the law follows attitudes. Attitudes change much faster, and the law's like lagging behind. It's probably the last thing to be changed, and politicians are so reluctant to do that. But in this case, Leslie Frost, an Ontario premier in the 1950s, even George Drew, although he was stuck in a minority government in Salzburg and other people forced him to change, they started passing human rights legislation in the 1940s, and ultimately, it was the beginning of, let's say, those kinds of changes. So by the 1950s, property covenants, court cases were being brought forward, and property covenants were made illegal. And Frost, who was, a waspy guy, his friends got mad at him and told him, I don't want, some Jew or black guy living next to me. And he told his friends that this is not the way people think. But in fact, most people did think that way, and it continued. It's not like it's changed overnight, but it's interesting to me that other provinces followed suit, and ultimately that was the beginning of how Canada changed. In at least making this stuff illegal. You don't change attitudes, and you're never going to change prejudice, but discrimination at least became illegal. And private clubs were much slower. I mean, let's say the Manitoba Club didn't, although there were attempts earlier, but they didn't really have a Jewish member until the 1970s, early 70s. And other private clubs were similar across Canada. I mean, this story was pretty similar. But if you think about the fact that a black person couldn't get a hotel room in Toronto in the 1940s, and then 25 years later, at least those kinds of things were changing. I mean, Jack London couldn't get a job in 1962 at a law firm, a great story that he's told. But I think by the 1970s, I'm pretty sure that those kinds of changes were being forced on the larger firms, even though some of the, let's say, older partners might not have felt that way. And medical clinics were no longer denying Jewish doctors' rights and having rights to use, and hospitals were changing their attitudes too. So institutionalized anti-Semitism changed. Now, so that I think is the main difference I would point out between today and yes, you have some violent people, you have lots of vandalism. You have fools running around doing all sorts of things. You have hate, but I see it still. It's not the same. In a sense, most Jewish people go about their daily lives, and their lives are not necessarily impacted by any kind of hatred or anti-Semitism. Yes, it interacts at points, and we're not talking about Pittsburgh here, but that's obviously a very extreme example. But I think in general, we have shifted, the world has shifted over if you look at the whole spectrum of how Canada has changed. and the United States too, to a certain extent. But listen, hate exists; it always will. You're never going to get rid of it, and that's just part of the larger story. I completely messed up. Let me just also add just a couple other sort of themes or trends that I have found. I mean, the most obvious is that Jews have amazing perseverance and survival instincts. They shouldn't be around. If you think about it, somehow Jews have figured out a way to adapt to living in societies largely unfriendly, and have figured out ways to be part of them and to fight for their rights, but not always. Quietly. It's always surprising. Like in the 1930s, when German Jewish refugees were being denied entry into Canada, the Jewish community did not. Were very reticent when people tried to make a bigger deal about it than they wanted to. Things were done very quietly, and lobbying was done in private meetings, and there were, the kind of protest meetings that you might get today were not all that common. So anybody who tried to make too much of a fuss and draw too much attention to themselves were necessarily frowned upon. I mean, Jews only represent about 1.2% of the country's total population, but there's also likely no field of endeavor, no profession, no pursuit in which a Jewish presence has not been or continued to be evident. I even found a Jewish woman named Sarah Kaufman, who was a championship mixed martial arts fighter in BC, although it's only her father who was Jewish. So this exceptional achievement did not happen overnight. The drive for excellence, I suppose, is based in large part by the immigrant mentality, parents pushing their children to make something of themselves and improve their lot in life. Throughout, as I said, bickering and divisiveness, and maybe that's part of being Jewish, it's rather endemic. Here's just one story, although it has nothing to do with Canada, I just like the story. Yeshiva University decided to hold a field crew team. They were going to field a crew team, a rowing team. Unfortunately, they lost race after race. They practiced for hours every day, but never managed to come in any better than dead last. The head of the yeshiva finally decided to send Yankel to spy on the Harvard team. So Yankel schlepped off to Cambridge and hid in the bulrushes off the Charles River, from where he carefully watched the Harvard team as they practiced. Yankel finally returned to yeshiva. "I have finally figured out their secret," he announced. "They have 8 guys rowing and only 1 guy shouting." That is the secret to it. So, as the great Yiddish writer, a line I use in Coming of Age, 2 Jews have 3 opinions. When one says this, the other says that, but not like that. Elaine Goldstein, who I interviewed for this book, said that she says that the incessant fetching, the members wouldn't complain so much if they didn't care. Another good story of Jewish bickering. There was a synagogue in 1890. A group of Galician Jews in Toronto had established a synagogue named Shomrei Shabbos. The men of Austria, they were from Austria. They used rented rooms on Richmond Street, downtown Toronto, before moving to a building on Chestnut Street, a little farther away, in 1899. 7 years later, the synagogue welcomed newly arrived Galician or Polish Austrian immigrants as members of the congregation, members who had their own idea about certain religious customs. A bitter feud soon erupted, naturally, between the two sides about the synagogue's practices and future directions. In April 1906, at the prayer service held on the eve of Passover, the newcomers and the older members became embroiled in a heated dispute over the synagogue's finances and operation. The disagreement turned into a physical altercation, and the police had to be called to break up the riot, which spilled out onto the street. The sordid details, much to the embarrassment of the entire Toronto Jewish community, were reported in the next day's newspaper. Most of the disgruntled members soon left the Shomrei Shabbos and joined another synagogue. There was no hiding their feelings of anger and defiance. Or kashrut policy is also famous. And in Toronto, there was a great feud between a group of rabbis. On one side, in the 1920s, there was this rabbi Jacob Gordon and Joseph Weinreb, who represented the influential Lithuanian, Galician, and Russian members. And on the other hand was this guy, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Grobart, who had arrived in Toronto in 1920 and became the spiritual leader of the city's Polish Jews and the head of a competing kosher council. Each faction attempted to control as many of the shachtim, the butchers, and the wholesalers as they could. Matters took a turn for a worse, an embarrassing one, according to some Toronto Jews, when in 1925 a local butcher, Jacob Cohn, who had been under the supervision of Gordon and Weintraub, switched his allegiance to Grobart. Cohn determined that he could obtain meat at a lower price from a wholesaler regulated by Grobart. Though other butchers had also done this, Gordon and Weintraub and their rabbinical allies publicly denounced the 40-year-old Cohn in a series of advertisements in the Yiddish newspaper for selling, quote, meat unfit according to law. Because it was reported to them that they had seen the shochet riding a streetcar on a Saturday, breaking the rules. In reality, the attack was aimed at Rabbi Grobart for challenging Gordon and Weintraub's authority and for asserting that he had set up a separate Kehillah, or council. So irate was Cohn that he took Gordon and Weintraub and two others to court for libeling him and trying to ruin his business. But the focus of the case was Cohn's connection to Grobart and Grobart's right to designate kosher meat. Uncertain how to handle this curious matter, Justice William H. Wright of the Supreme Court of Ontario took the unprecedented route of convening a rabbinical tribunal to determine the legitimacy of Grobart's Kehillah. The Toronto press was not sure what to make of the case either, nor the three American rabbis invited to the city to render a decision. The Star found them, quote, venerable figures in black skullcaps and black robes, yet also jolly men whose eyes twinkled. In their ruling, the visiting rabbis vindicated Gordon and Weintraub and compelled Grobart to compromise and join their Kehillah, the only one Toronto could have according to Jewish law. They deemed all others were forbidden. Rabbi Grobart reluctantly merged his group with Gordon's, though the animosity continued and Grobart refused to attend meetings if Gordon was present. Until further disputes arose in the 1930s challenging the Kehillah's power, Toronto Jews had one body of rabbis supervising and determining kosher regulations. So that was the other division, of course, I guess you would call it, is more class, in that, so say something in the garment industry, the Jewish owners and you know, Leonard Cohn's grandfather, Lyon Cohn, was a great guy. It's kind of ironic, you know, he gave to charity, he was a great philanthropist, but boy, was he tough with his employees, all over Jewish. And he wouldn't put up with, and so Montreal has a long history of strikes, like Winnipeg and Toronto. And the Jewish owners were pretty ruthless in how they treated their Jewish workers. And so that was a clear division. Rabbis were caught in the middle in terms of some of the synagogues, and they tried to always make the peace. But I think that was also kind of an interesting. You know, the conflicts were really a fight about who had the money and which community and how that money was spent in creating the organizational structure. The men in charge did not want to be told what to do, and certainly not by their wives or other women. There were some exceptions, and I write about Ida Siegel in Toronto, Lillian Freeman in Ottawa. She was probably the more famous. Her and her husband Archie were well-known Zionist leaders in the first part of the 20th century, and then women were, I suppose, generally relegated to Jewish ladies groups such as the Dawson Pioneer Women, but I do trace the beginning of Marjorie became head of the WJCC and Rabbinic Jewish Community Council, and also other women in Montreal and Toronto who rose to the top, and they experienced all sorts of male chauvinism. One woman told me, what's her name, from Montreal, about how they tried to get her to cry, but she wouldn't, and she stood her ground, and you know, those changes, it took till the 1980s. I think the first president, the first woman to be head of the Canadian Jewish Congress was probably like into the early 80s. So here you have like 70 years it takes for women to rise to the top. So those are just some of the trends. I guess I would say that the interesting thing I thought at the end of the book, you know, obviously there's a decline of religion, assimilation is growing, being Jewish is very expensive. People are not sending their kids to schools. Intermarriage rates are very high. I mean, those are some of the issues that Jews have been dealing with for a long time, and probably the great threat to the community. Some communities, like in the Maritimes, are dwindling, and once the intermarriage rates are high, they leave the community and they're not really part of it. Those are the kinds of things, I guess, that would generally be a greater threat to Jewish communities in terms of in the future than say some of the stuff that you read about in the newspapers. I guess the other thing that I've often thought when I was doing all the research, is it really important to always identify someone as being Jewish? I mean, it's important that, is a doctor, is a great surgeon, does it matter that he's Jewish? I mean, if we have come to the point now where those kinds of where it's not necessary to always point that out. The rabbis I talked to did think it was obviously important to keep pointing it out, and that it's part of Jewish history, and that we should always make a note of that. I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting. I don't have all the answers about that. I think we got to a point now. You don't necessarily see someone identified as being Jewish in the newspaper all the time now when they're identified, whereas they probably would have been 50, 60 years ago. So maybe we have come. But there is a tendency by newspapers to still identify people from minority groups or something like that. Maybe that's just part of the society in which we live. I'm not sure exactly. I do know that the community in Canada is kind of interesting. A lot of the book focuses really on Montreal and Toronto, because something like 85-90% of the Jews in Canada live in those two cities, Toronto in particular. One of the rabbis at the Reformed Synagogue, Rabbi Splansky, who's now at the Holy Blossom, told me your kids don't even know that being Jewish in Toronto is a minority because there's so many. I mean, that's a unique city, and there's hundreds of thousands of people and every possible institution available. A city like Winnipeg is hanging in, but we always have issues. Less synagogues, no kosher, or rarely, but kosher butchers are down. People don't go to synagogue in the same way. But we have this place, and a lot of other communities this size wouldn't have an institution like this. Anyways, I'm going to stop there, and I will take any questions if you like.
First, you cover at all the tuxedo issue of
In this book, no. I do in the other book.
Okay, fair enough. The other question is, when you discuss the situation of the Jews in the early 20th century,
Yes.
it occurred to me that there's a strong parallel between what's going on right now with the Islamic community, where they're being, let's say, castigated for demanding that we abandon our ritual feelings and adopt theirs, etc.
Right.
Which
Although I don't think Jews probably didn't really do that. I don't know. I don't.
Well, just parallel.
Yeah, I said
Christmas
no,
story.
right. Yeah, I don't know if it's. I don't know if I'd make that comparison, but.
Okay.
But I mean, Jews are pretty reticent. I mean, they protect, participated, but they didn't necessarily foist that story with just overreaction to one comment. And Feinberg was a rather, the Holy Blossom was a rather assimilated synagogue in Toronto of people and it was a Reformed synagogue, and so maybe that's what he said.
But in Winnipeg, you don't see the Muslim pressure
No.
at all. So, but you hear the stories that they are demanding that, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wondering.
Maybe that's also an overreaction.
Much of that, I would say that much of that is unfortunately rumors made up by people who have
Right.
some racist sentiments about
Yeah.
Muslims.
Therefore, it's a parallel.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess, yeah.
for instance, we get this, I'm sure that many of you have received an email that said that in England, they stopped teaching about the Holocaust. Well, actually, it's one of the few countries in the world where Holocaust education is mandated by law. And I heard a presentation by 2 teachers who teach in schools in Manchester, where the population of the school is 85% Muslim immigrant children, and they teach on the Holocaust. So a lot of it is just unfortunately rumor that.
Well, I agree, that's what goes on.
I have a question. Thanks for your presentation. I appreciate what you said about the evolution of anti-Semitism, but there's not only been an evolution in attitudes, there's also been an evolution in the way vocabulary is used. I mean, anti-Semitism was developed as a term by anti-Semites, and originally anti-Semites self-identified as anti-Semites, and now they don't.
Right.
But in Germany, there was a league of anti-Semites, there were parties that were called anti-Semites. And my question is, in Canada, did that happen? I mean, I know there was anti-Semitism before, but were there self-identified people who actually used the term anti-Semites for themselves?
Members of the Social Credit Party would have in Alberta, probably not all, although they tended to, Eberhard, the Premier of Alberta, tended to try to push that aside, but there were certainly members of it that would have used this. Adrian Arcan in Quebec, I guess, would be the most example of the person. And I mean, you know, I get into the issue of whether, I don't necessarily think Quebec was any more anti-Semitic, but there was a lot. It does seem at times there was much more in the press about anti-Semitism and Jews, although they may not have self-identified it in that way. Let's say like the mayor of Vienna, I think, was a classic guy. He ran an anti-Semitic platform for years and kept being re-elected before the First World War. So, but yeah, it was much more subtle, I think. I mean, if you read the property covenants, though, those things are, you know, fascinating.
I read
no Jews, no blacks. Yeah, I mean, Negroes they called them, but in the contracts that stipulated that people can't buy these properties, it's unreal.
Well, how did they get away with it in Tuxedo? Well, I mean, the mayor was Jewish.
Well, he was, I remember the story. He married a non-Jewish woman and didn't, even though he came from the Finkelstein family, I believe that he was talking about. It's an interesting story. I don't know exactly, but he decided to go along with it for business reasons. And not that a lot of Jews, I don't think, wanted to live in Tuxedo at the time when he was the mayor, to be perfectly honest. I mean, the city, it was a separate city. It was far from, there weren't probably very many Jews attempting to live here. Yes, no, I never was able to track that down. I went to the city archives. I tried to find records that actually existed. I mean, people said it existed, but I could never find. But I didn't, unless you know people who attempted to buy property and were told they couldn't. Yeah, I think, but yeah, exactly. I mean, but this is also what 1920 or earlier. So there weren't many Jews who were going to live out here anyways. They were just moving to the parts of River Heights, some, and that was a small amount of people. So you know, most Jews, as I've written, I think what in 1941, 42, something like 85% of Jews lived within about a kilometer and a half of Salter and Aberdeen. So in Winnipeg. So there you go. They were moving to Tuxedo, which is a separate city. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you didn't think that we sort of extolled our own when something great is written about it. And yet, but we don't do that.
Well, we do. No. I mean, I wasn't sure whether or not we should, as opposed to whether do we. I guess to a certain extent. Well, we do. I mean, the Jewish Post certainly does. But whether or not it necessarily is in the mainstream media. Not necessarily, I don't think.
Well, I keep getting emails from various people, not all Jews, about different Jews who have done great things.
Right.
And how also when they're sort of Muslims say that he should be loved off his there, or not to frequent or buy anything Jewish, that they would. There's a whole list of things that were created by Jews that they would no longer have use of if came carried out. Well, I get this from non-Jews as well as Jews and send it on to other
Yeah.
countries.
It's just something, this is a matter of Julian Edelman from the Super Bowl Patriots the other day. It turns out, because I was interested in his name, and it turns out, in fact, his father's Jewish, his mother isn't, but he does identify as being Jewish. And, but, no one mentioned that on the broadcast or anything. I mean, it's only Jews.
No, but it was mentioned in the room. I guess.
Yeah, Jews themselves we're fascinated with all this. Whether the larger world actually cares anymore, they may have years ago. I mean, I don't. Did people even in Wayne and Schuster I was talking about earlier? Did people non-Jews think about them as being Jewish? And they were the highest paid entertainers in Canada in the early '60s. I don't know. I doubt it.
Well, wouldn't you say that all of the different ethnic communities, just out of a certain
Yes.
ethnic, religious pride,
Right.
we all do this? I
Yes.
mean, it's just.
No, and my book is full of Jewish firsts. I have 10 dozens of them. I couldn't avoid it. You can't avoid first Jewish judge, first Jewish this, that. I mean, it's impossible to avoid because it's a mark of the community evolving and being successful. But again, those are, I always thought the fact that you had Jewish judges appointed in the 1950s, and this is such a big deal. How sad, how somewhat sad. What does that say about Canada as a whole, anyway? Yes.
I'm just very curious. In your research, when you were talking about the Jewish community in Montreal, did you come across the book, The History of the Jews in Canada by Ben Sack?
Yeah,
The reason I ask is that was written, Ben Sack was my maternal great uncle, editor of the Canada Rocket, the Yiddish newspaper, and it was translated by my father.
That was one of the few first Jewish.
Sort of complete history. He started with the Hearts and
right. I mean, those kinds of books. Right. Yes.
Just small. I was really lost in Feinberg.
Oh, really?
Feinberg, every single week, he delivered hot tub. Really.
Right.
I used to go on Friday nights religiously to catch, not the religious circle, but Feinberg's tirade.
Yes.
And I can tell you my recollection was that the harsh critique of him came from other mainstream Jews, not the Yiddish speakers, but the mainstream either Orthodox.
Yes. Well, there's a right.
Everyone, and there was only basically one synagogue that was reformed. It was Holy Lost.
Yes.
And it was a large synagogue.
Yeah.
It was the largest in town for a while.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh, it still is.
It is.
It's the largest
But that building was
synagogue in
built
town.
in the 1930s when no one had jobs, so they built it very cheap. With less workers than they paid about it in those days. And they referred to us as the church on the hill, because it was up high. And Feinberg was, now I don't know if there was pressure from Gentiles, but the Jewish community in general, because on my mother's side they were Reformed, but on my dad's side they were Orthodox, but on the other side they were Reformed. So my cousins, I knew what the other major Jewish community were saying about that. And it was hostility that was felt like, shh, look what happened to Germany. Keep a low profile.
Right.
Don't make enemies.
Yes.
And the enemies that were worried about it was the mainstream community, but it was the Jewish rabbis and congregations that were criticizing Feinberg for that.
Thank you very much, Allan, for this presentation, which I'm sure that we will all follow up because it's one of Allan's remarkable strong points is his ability to put scholarship together with telling interesting stories. books are always a pleasure to read. We can continue this over